Science and RE are often thought to be antagonistic, so RE teachers can understandably be anxious when they want to mix the two. To help teachers get to grips with using science in RE, we filmed a workshop organised by the Science and Religion in Schools project, a new initiative encouraging schools to teach issues concerning science and RE. The workshop, for 3 secondary RE teachers, highlights the approach of exploring the dialogue between science and religion, this time focusing on 3 core areas of the RE curriculum. Firstly, there's an opportunity to find out more about how to deal with the topic of miracles, as the group discussed this and ideas about different types of explanations. Secondly, they look at how an environmental ethics lesson could be planned using the notion of model making, a device that is used in both science and RE. And lastly, they look at a novel way of unpacking the topic of creation, using the idea of forming your own planet. Assisted by Paul Hopkins, the Science and Religion in Schools project manager, the workshop was led by project editor-in-chief Adrian Brown.
There are lots of perfectly valid takes on reality, and RE has got something to give to this, science has got something to give to this, the arts have, music has. Are there any examples you've tried in lessons where you've looked at this notion?
Yes, in an RE lesson with Year 7s we looked at what a person was worth made of their physical elements, and quite a lot of the students were shocked to find that they were only worth a few pounds and pence.
An example would be with a GCSE group looking at medical ethics. Take one area, abortion, where we'd start off with a discussion, and it can so easily get out of hand with no real coherence.
I've often left RE lessons thinking these children are now just in a mess.
I think scientific tools of evidence are actually really useful to bring into the RE classroom. You're not just arguing because I believe, it's how do I back this up? So if I'm saying this is what a Christian believes, well, where am I gathering my evidence from?
I know very few teachers who are happy with just allowing people to stay where they are because that happens to be their current received view. That's not what educators are about. We want to move kids on from that. Miracle as a term has been used in a number of ways. There are many different types of explanation used in both science and religion. Question why has a variety of possible answers, and these types of answer don't necessarily conflict with one another. So we must use the terms logical and rational very carefully. An interesting way to investigate miracles is to take an example and look at scientific and religious understandings of the same event. Let's do miracles. Where would you begin?
Usually we'd start with a brainstorm, getting the students to define their own version of the word miracle.
And actually that's quite a helpful distinction to make when you're dealing with any concept in religious studies or in science. Recognise that in fact definitions tend to be when a community has settled on a preferred usage of a term. The problem with definitions is it can exclude any alternative candidates as a sort of power play. You know, miracles will mean violations of laws of nature, and I have said so. Can rule out lots of perfectly legitimate ways of using the term miracle. We do that to begin with. What would you be wanting to achieve if you were setting up a GCSE lesson on miracles?
I would say that an aim would be to enable the children to realise that there are many different descriptions and definitions of miracles, be able to name a few.
Is there a third issue, and that is the issue of are these things in the real world, or are we just talking about some nice little abstract discussion here, and why would it matter that miracles is in our topic anyway? If I put real, and perhaps we need then to look at examples, presumably we'd have to have some sort of criteria to measure our examples against. How can you test these things?
This is where I think I want to bring the science in, because from this human definition of something which is against the laws of nature or the laws of science, I'd want to be saying, well, can we describe these events in scientific terms that we already understand? Can we find a rational explanation? Or is it an irrational event? Are there expert opinion from expert from science, not just an expert from other areas?
So we might have some science experts here. I guess we ought to have some theological experts with their two pennyworth.
We started the lesson with a brainstorm where the children described and defined and gave examples of miracles. Is that right? So then, in the sort of the main body of the lesson, what would you suggest that we gave? Perhaps if we did the Red Sea, we could give a scientific explanation of the parting of the Red Sea with regard. There's talk about the volcano, isn't there? We could give the biblical text as well, and then the children have to perhaps compare and contrast.
I don't know I'd go that way. I think what I'd want to question is this idea of supernatural. Does something have to be supernatural in order to be a miracle?
Yeah.
So I think what often happens is you get bogged down in this, well, we must find a scientific explanation for. I think actually sometimes you need to get beyond that.
Yes.
And say that it's not actually always a question of finding a scientific answer which knocks down your miracle. You're very much into this idea of God of the gaps otherwise.
Yeah, this is I think an important concept in the science-religion dialogue. The fact that because there are different types of explanation, just because you give a comprehensive explanation from one point of view of an event doesn't mean that there isn't anything else happening there, or that God is not in some way superintending that which you might describe as natural. And therefore, if we scrutinise that, using the test that we were going to apply, it will be a very good example to use in a general discussion on miracles.
Environmental ethics is an important but difficult topic. There's a vitally important dialogue between religion, science and ethics in our concern for the environment. One useful teaching technique to understand the complex relationships in this area is probably to use the notion of models. Science uses models all the time. For instance, the model of an atom as electrons orbiting a nucleus. And religious language, in turn, is also full of models. The model of God as Father is an obvious one. So we should be able to construct models to help students get a better understanding of environmental ethics.
So environment and the whole sort of ethical dimension, and concepts like stewardship, responsibility. Right. Now, how might we introduce those kinds of things to students in a lesson?
I think I'd start off with those two key questions that we want, which is what has science got to say about these things, and what has religion got to say about these things? It's actually, what's your relationship with a creator God that charges you to have responsibility for the created planet? So it's about those sort of deeper issues.
And I like that idea of relationships, where you say, okay, if I'm religious, I believe I've got a relationship with God. I have relationships with others. Interestingly, I have a relationship with myself, which often goes missing. Love your neighbour as you love yourself presupposes you've learnt to love yourself. And there's a lot of RE in that, isn't there? I have a relationship to other creatures. And the one that in history has often gone missing is I have a relationship to the planet. So if you set up that as a framework, you could then maybe ask questions about, so what does that relationship between you and your God, perhaps collectively, your relationship together in community, have to say about all these other dimensions of how you relate to the world?
Does that change the focus slightly though, away from the four things at the top? Or
if you did it this way, you could say, okay, the environment's clearly come in as the thing you're relating to. The ethical issues are to do with how you relate to others. On what basis do you do X, Y, and Z? Stewardship is the theological concept of if God has put you in a particular place where you have responsibility for the world, how do you exercise that responsibility? And responsibility has already been talked about in the same sentence.
we just have these five figures, including the Earth, as a basic model, and then you could have you've got their blank sheet which they can do their own interpretation on, but they could also have one with a scientific interpretation of relationships and causes and consequences, and then they could have one with religious ones as well.
Yeah, using the same thing after looking at religious models of how all those things interact with each other, and the same with science, then make their own one, how they think, what they think the relationship is.
There really is a dialogue going on all over the place, isn't there? And one of the myths that's been around for far too long is that science is somehow not just neutral in terms of its method and what it does, but really shouldn't be in dialogue at all with anybody else. But actually, inescapably, because we are the scientists. These are some of the insights and understandings that we've gleaned, which can be used for good or for ill. So what ethical basis am I going to have for choosing which bits of science to do, where and when and how? To what extent do my religious points of view inform not just my ethical positions, but also my relationship to the science that I undertake? I like that. That's excellent, isn't it?
Everyone's got a worldview. Whether you believe in God or not affects the way you see everything. For instance, if you read scriptures literally, many scientific discoveries have to be radically reinterpreted. Alternatively, an understanding of well-established science may inform how scripture's read. By using a scheme of work developed by the Science and Religion in Schools project called Terraforming, pupils can assess the narratives in the light of what we've learnt from science and begin to investigate non-literal interpretations of the creation narratives.
Terraforming is the notion that you might take another planet and turn it into something that was more like that of the Earth. Mars, I suppose, in our solar system will be the most likely candidate for all sorts of technical reasons. But would you want to do that? And if you did do that, do planets have rights? Who should choose? How should you spend the money? What does God think about all of this?
I think what's really exciting here is if you take something like creation, this concept of creation, which is a pretty abstract idea, and what this does is it roots into not just something which is complete fantasy, but the idea about terraforming is something that kids will know about from their science fiction. But they probably haven't thought about it in terms of this theological idea about if you go about creating something, what are the issues that are involved?
And of course you're immediately back there into all those questions about how you read the Genesis story in the Garden of Eden. Did God create a perfect scenario which went wrong, or did he create something which he declared to be very good, but was in process?
Personally, I think it throws up so many questions and so many different areas of RE.
I think a really interesting way of tackling this issue is just set them the task. Okay, if you're terraforming your planet, following the script of Genesis, what happens? Get them to play out that story. Let's look at the problems that arise, perhaps our technical and scientific problems in playing out that narrative. Now let's go back to the narrative and start to be slightly more critical of it and say, well, obviously it's not a set of instructions on how to make a planet, is it? So maybe it's something else.
Do you think that might work in the sort of lessons, Bernard, that you have where you're dealing with the issue of creation as a concept?
One of the things I'd have to set myself is, well, in this lesson we're going to investigate the word and uses of the word perfect. I think once I had that basis to move from, I'd feel much happier.
I don't think that initially they would probably think about all the different parts that would need to come together to make something perfect, and I think they'd probably just be quite thinking about themselves to start off with. I don't think they'd realise how complex it actually all was. So it would be good for them, I think.
And all the questions of the problem of evil, the problem of suffering and pain, if you're sentient, and self-consciousness and so on, is going to spring out of that almost without having to say, right, today's lesson is going to be on pain and suffering, today's lesson is going to be on. It will come out simply because you're faced with the task of devising that perfect planet and putting people on it. And if nothing else comes out of it, I'd settle for that at the end of a lesson.
For more examples of how you can use science in RE, visit www.teachers.tv.